Hey guys, this is Talissa and Kelsey. Our presentation is on foster care and kinship foster care, specifically these foster parents, grandparents that are raising grandchildren, and the children that are in their care. Media portrayal of these foster families tends to be negative. I mean, you have the evil stepmother scenario. An example of this would be Harry Potter. While he's not being raised by his grandparents, he is being raised by an aunt and uncle that have a negative relationship with him. He lives in a closet under the stairs. He doesn't have new clothes. It's just a negative situation where he doesn't get the care that he needs. Um, a really bit a negative stigma on foster families that they're just doing it for money. They're doing it for the monetary gain from taking on these children. The media likes to portray these kids as difficult. They have lots of behavioral issues. They'll hurt your other children, things like that, which is completely false. And there rarely are these situations portrayed as loving and wholesome. The benefits of family and peer support are huge. Family support can almost make or break these situations. For example, you look at a foster parent. If their biological children do not support bringing in a foster child into that home, that's going to all around have a negative, it's going to be dysfunctional, it's going to have a negative outcome, it's going to make things a lot more difficult. Whereas if those biological children support this and are excited to have these foster children come into their home, that's going to be a positive thing for that child. When you have adequate family support, you have access to more resources. You give these foster children an opportunity to see and be a part of a functional family. These families that have good support tend to give these kids better education opportunities, which will improve their futures drastically. And overall, they tend to have better outcomes. When they have peer support, that also will have a positive impact. So peer support can be anybody other than family. This is your caseworker, your social worker, clinician, your therapist, your friend, your neighbor, a church member, leader if you're involved in that. And then it can be support groups too. Support groups are huge. This gives support to foster parents, to grandparents raising grandparents. You can get be involved in a very specific type of group, which is very beneficial because then you're connected with these people that understand similar situations. They understand what you're going through and they're able to help you cope and give you ideas and suggestions for different situations and behaviors. And that overall is going to increase the success of this experience. Um, like it says, increases opportunities for mentoring and coaching, and again with increased peer support and a more multi-factor support for these children, they're going to have better opportunities, including educational opportunities, and this will all around just lead to better outcomes. Legal and political impacts are huge. It's obvious a lot of what happens to these kids is dictated by laws and policies, and for the most part these laws and policies are there to protect the children, but there are some instances when it can kind of hinder these situations. For example, um, say you have a grandparent raising a grandchild, they may have a hard time being able to get legal guardianship of that child. And if they don't have that legal guardianship, that can make it really difficult to enroll them in school or get them, the right health care, or, just little things like that. It can limit their, it just limits them. Also, there are some laws that kids of a certain age can have a say in who becomes their legal guardian. And they may not always choose the more beneficial person to become that guardian, which then can lead to a negative outcome. As populations increase and our world is ever changing, these laws and policies need to be constantly evaluated and reassessed and determined. Do we need to tweak things or change things? So this is something that politicians are looking at, but also I mean, all these different groups that are involved in this for, public health officials, you need to watch these and make sure that what we're doing is for the benefit of these children and these families. In foster care, about 31% of foster parents are employed full time. The mean income of foster parents is about one third lower than average, and this is a typo, but foster families usually fall, they usually do not fall below the poverty level. A small percentage of them are below the poverty level, most of them are above. When you contrast that to grandparents, 58% of them are employed full time. 21% live in poverty, and a quarter of them have a disability. I mean, just that right there is going to increase the stress and the difficulty for these grandparents to care for these grandchildren. About 52% of grandfamilies are white. 44% of children in foster care are white, while 21% are African American and 20% are Hispanic. When you look at the distribution of kids in foster care, 48% are female and 52% are male. About 46% of grandparent homes are grandmother led, while only 5% are single grandfather led homes. Religion does not play a significant role in whether the prevalence of these grand families and foster families. Geographical location is huge. You just look at a rural versus urban. Urban areas have access to a significantly more, greater amount of resources, which ultimately ends up in more positive outcomes. So when you're looking at a family that's in a rural area, they have decreased access to resources. It's going to be harder to get to these resources. A lot of these families are often living around the poverty level. This can impact whether they have access to a vehicle, a working vehicle, or the ability to drive, or the time. They may have one or two jobs, just even time is limited. They're going to a lot of times have decreased support. There is a decreased access to very limited qualified providers. They may not have in a rural area a provider that's qualified to deal with a particular child's situation or health problem or behavioral issue, which that right there will have a negative impact. They have found it when they've done studies and looked at the information and statistics, that these foster families, whether it's kinship or foster parents, the placement stability is overall decreased. They tend to bounce around more because these families get stressed. They get worn out, burnt out. They can't deal with it. And this has a negative impact on these children. And that will carries over to their physical and mental health. They have an increased risk for developing mental health illnesses, which that will just lead to adverse outcomes. Or telemedicine use would be pretty beneficial in this population. It's going to improve their access to resources and increase the number of potential providers to choose from, and it eliminates transportation issues because they don't have to drive anywhere. They can just have it right to their home. Really, the biggest limitation to this, though, is do they have access to video capabilities? Do they have a smartphone? Do they have a tablet or a computer? Do they even have internet? Without some of those devices or, commodities, this may not work for them. Assuming that they do, it's going to definitely increase compliance in the care plan. They have access to support networks, to information, to providers. They'll be able to draw on all these different things to help them during stressful times. And especially with developing that care plan, they're going to be able to follow through with that, which will increase their overall health and increase the placement stability, which leads to just overall more positive outcome. Again, like we talked about in the beginning, there are several barriers due to stigmas and biases. There's the media portrayed stigmas. We went over that. Economic status tends to be a stigma that these people are poor, that they, or that they're doing it to gain money because they're poor. The age of children has a huge impact. Unfortunately, it's easy to place younger children, but these older children, the older they get, the harder it is to place them, which that has a negative. How does a child of any age deal with that kind of trauma and situation. So there's definitely a stigma there that younger children are going to be easier, and the older children are scared to take them. There's biases and barriers due to health. These kids tend to have a greater, and not only the kids, the foster parents, these grandparents that are raising grandchildren, there's a greater increase of mental health issues, which can end up leading to more chronic issues over time. A lot of grandparent led families are due to, there's a pretty significant portion of them that are due to the opioid crisis. A lot of these grandparents are raising their children due to some form of opioid dependency. There are recurring vulnerabilities in this population. These kids that come out of foster care, not all of them, obviously, this doesn't apply to the 100% of this population, but a significant portion of them are at a greater risk of having the same thing happen, of perpetuating the cycle. So parents who experience child abuse as a child are 5 times more likely to abuse their children and 1.4 times more likely to neglect their own children. Parents who experience neglect, 2 times more likely to abuse, 2.6 times more likely to neglect their children. Compare this to parents who did not experience any maltreatment, and only 0.4% of them maltreat their own children. And then you factor in these kids that grow up in foster care, and you can almost, it just is more impactful. These kids are at an even greater risk of this. They found that 77% of females that by the time that grew up in foster care, by the time they're 24, 77% of those girls will have at least one child, and 60% of those males will have fathered at least one child. That's a huge, and most of the time this is a single parent situation, and they don't finish school and they don't have a job, which just perpetuates the stress, and the cycle leads to mental health issues, which leads to neglect, and the cycle continues. Some protective factors: if they can be placed with a family that has a very strong, loving, supportive marriage, or even just a stable relationship, that will have a good impact. Having grandparents or foster parents that have some form of higher education, the greater the educational opportunities they provide for these kids, and overall just better outcome. They also tend to have, with increased social and emotional support, will also give these kids an edge. It'll hopefully help give them that opportunity to break out of the cycle. There are some global considerations when you're looking at Africa. Kids that are placed in foster care due to HIV or AIDS, there's a heavy stigma associated with that, and families are really reluctant to take those kids. Finances has a huge impact. A lot of families in poverty are not going to be able to take on an extra child. Family values, cultural, it varies by cultural. Some cultures are more likely to care for their kin than others. And then the importance of education. They've found, certain countries place a higher importance on education than others, which will then it impacts the opportunities for education that these kids have. And then just awareness. In Russia, foster care is relatively new. They found when they did some kind of send out a survey, a lot of these respondents didn't even realize that foster care was a thing, didn't know what it was. So just the awareness in some of these areas where it's a fairly new thing is going to impact these populations and their well-being. So then these are references, a lot of good information, and a lot of really impactful information too for these populations, and the impact that just everything that they experience and go through and deal with, and impact that has on their health and well-being.